Houston Texans. It's now the San Francisco 49ers pick. They're up. It's the Tennessee Titans now on the clock. The Atlanta Falcons are now on the clock. Up next, the Philadelphia Eagles are on the clock. And now, on the clock, it's the Arizona Cardinals. The Chicago Bears are now on the clock. It's the Detroit Lions now on the clock. Next up, it's the Seahawks on the clock. Now on the clock, the Washington Commanders. With the next pick, the Jacksonville Jaguars are on the clock. It's the Steelers now on the clock. The Baltimore Ravens are on the clock now. It's now the Vikings' turn on the clock. It's the Buffalo Bills now on the clock. The Cardinals on the clock now. The Los Angeles Chargers now on the clock. Now on the clock, the Giants. The Kansas City Chiefs now on the clock. It's the Cowboys now on the clock. The 49ers on the clock now. Next up, the Titans are on the clock.
She-Rag got me.
It's the Atlanta Falcons now on the clock. Now we turn to the Eagles. They're on the clock. On the clock now, the Chicago Bears. The New Orleans Saints are now on the clock. It's the Bears now on the clock. The Seattle Seahawks are now on the clock. The Washington Commanders are now on the clock. On the clock now, the Jacksonville Jaguars. The Pittsburgh Steelers on the clock now. On the clock now, the Baltimore Ravens. The Bengals now on the clock. The Buffalo Bills are now on the clock. It's now the Arizona Cardinals selection. They're on the clock. On the clock now, it's the Los Angeles Chargers. The New York Giants on the clock. Next up, the Commanders are on the clock. On the clock now, the Houston Texans. Next up, the Jets are on the clock. It's the Philadelphia Eagles now on the clock. The Carolina Panthers now on the clock. On the clock now, the New Orleans Saints. The Denver Broncos are now on the clock. On the clock now, the Seattle Seahawks. With the next selection, it's the Washington Commanders. The Jaguars are on the clock. The New York Jets are now on the clock. Next up, it's the Packers on the clock. The Minnesota Vikings now on the clock. On the clock now, the Buffalo Bills. The Arizona Cardinals are now on the clock. Now on the clock, the Los Angeles Chargers. And now on the clock, it's the 49ers. The Colts now on the clock. On the clock now, the Dallas Cowboys. Now on the clock, the Texans. The San Francisco 49ers are now on the clock. On the clock now, it's the Tennessee Titans. Ladies and gentlemen, the current pick has been traded. On the clock now, it's the Atlanta Falcons. On the clock now, the Detroit Lions. The Tennessee Titans are now on the clock. The next pick has been traded. The Chicago Bears are on the clock now. The Detroit Lions now on the clock. Now the Seattle Seahawks are on the clock. Now on the clock, the Washington Commanders. The Jaguars are on the clock now. With the next selection, the New York Jets. The Green Bay Packers are on the clock. The Minnesota Vikings are now on the clock. It's the Bills now on the clock. The Indianapolis Colts are now on the clock. Now on the clock, it's the Las Vegas Raiders. The Chargers are up now. They're on the clock. The New York Giants are now on the clock. Next up, The Indianapolis Colts are on the clock. The Dallas Cowboys now on the clock. The Houston Texans are now on the clock. It's the Carolina Panthers now on the clock. With the next selection, the Falcons are on the clock. The New England Patriots are now on the clock. The Chicago Bears are now on the clock. With the next selection, the Lions are on the clock. Next up, it's the Seahawks on the clock. The Washington Commanders are now on the clock. With the next pick, the Jacksonville Jaguars are on the clock. With the next selection, it's the Pittsburgh Steelers. With the next selection, the Ravens are on the clock. With the next selection, the Cincinnati Bengals are on the clock. The Los Angeles Rams are up. They're on the clock. With the next pick, the Raiders are on the clock. It's the Bucks now on the clock. On the clock now, the Kansas City Chiefs. The Dallas Cowboys are now on the clock. On the clock now, the Houston Texans. On the clock now, it's the Green Bay Packers. The Philadelphia Eagles on the clock now. With the next selection, the Carolina Panthers on the clock. It's the New Orleans Saints now on the clock. On the clock now, it's the Denver Broncos. With the next pick, the Miami Dolphins are on the clock. It's the Cleveland Browns now on the clock. The New York Jets on the clock now. The Green Bay Packers are now on the clock. there has been a trade. Next up, the Cleveland Browns are on the clock. Now on the clock, the Giants. And now on the clock, it's the Arizona Cardinals. The Los Angeles Chargers now on the clock. The New York Giants on the clock. The Cardinals on the clock now. On the clock now, the Houston Texans. The Atlanta Falcons are now on the clock. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a trade. With the next pick, the Kansas City Chiefs are now on the clock. It's the Cowboys now on the clock. Up next, the Philadelphia Eagles are on the clock. Next up, it's the Broncos on the clock. On the clock now, the New England Patriots. The Pittsburgh Steelers are now on the clock. Now on the clock, the San Francisco 49ers. And now on the clock, the Minnesota Vikings. The Baltimore Ravens now on the clock. Next up, the Cincinnati Bengals are on the clock. Now on the clock, the Rams. It's the Tennessee Titans now on the clock. The Las Vegas Raiders are on the clock. On the clock now, it's the Los Angeles Chargers. Next up, it's the Packers on the clock. It's now the Indianapolis Colts selection. And now on the clock, it's the 49ers.